Well, hello and welcome. My name is Francois Colette, and today's sessions is part of a Stays Connected platform for which we offer different webinar sessions covering current issues, which are available on our website as well as on our YouTube and LinkedIn channels. Our aim with these webinars is to share academic knowledge and experience with all of you. So I'm Francois Colette, Professor of Organizational Behavior, and today I'm delighted to have with me Professor Jaume Villanueva from Rutgers University, Professor of Entrepreneurship. And today we'll be talking about building a healthier future, cooperation and ideology in a time of crisis. So Jaume, I'll let you to introduce to the audience first.
Thank you, Francois. Thank you so much for inviting me to this webinar. So good morning, everyone. Good morning it's morning here in New York City. A bit foggy, but nevertheless. So my job today is not so much to be a skeptic or a Debbie Downer, but rather to provide, just to bring up a couple of challenges that we may be facing today as we try to collaborate across ideological boundaries. So with the purpose of having a perhaps more nuanced, more complete, not so over-optimistic view. And so, Francois is going to make an exposition of his ideas, basically uninterrupted. And then at the end, I'm going to come up with a couple of ideas or challenges we need to overcome so that he can and we both can respond to them. So that's it. Go ahead, Francois.
So, and at the end of the dialogue between the two of us, I will moderate the Q&A sessions with the questions that arise through the chat, that you can send through the chat. And the duration of this seminar is about 30 minutes. And remember that our sessions will be available for our different channels. So the title of the session is Building a Healthy Future, Cooperation Ideology in Times of Crisis. So I will have two parts. The first part is about cooperation. Cooperation has a long game. And the second part will be about how do you deal with ideological divide. So the first part, cooperation has a long game. So I will start with a story. The story is a Frenchman at the end of the First World War, Émile Dutch de la Mort. And this Frenchman was Jewish, and he gave to the city of Paris. He made a large donation to build a campus, a very beautiful leafy campus that you can still see today, with a rose garden that looks like an Oxford College. And he wanted French and German students to study side by side together after this terrible war, learn together, build friendship, understand each other, and build a basis of cooperation between the two nations. 20 years later, after the inauguration of this campus, tragically, Jewish children were taken out of their school and bring on a train with their parents to be exterminated. This was a tragedy, not a failure of all this, the initiative of all these ideas that they would build a world of where people would cooperate and live together in peace. At the same time, in 1922, in 1918, 1922, at that time, after the end of the war, First World War, another person, a young man of less than 30 years old, was working for the French cabinet, the Ministry of Agriculture, the cabinet of the minister. And he was working towards building cooperation between France and Britain to develop industrial cooperation, economic cooperation, to build a basis of the rebuilding of Europe after this war. And he was also the witness of the negotiations of the peace treaties, among which the Versailles Treaty is the most famous one, which put on Germany a Carthaginian peace. And he could see from the beginning how this treaty would not set a solid basis for peace, just as John Maynard Keynes wrote in The Economic Consequences of Peace, a book that sold a lot after World War I. And he could also see how the League of Nations, which was built to install this new world order, now in Geneva, hosting the UN, with these beautiful paintings given by a Spanish artist just on the eve of the Spanish Civil War, how this effort was also an utter failure. How the U.S. pulled out to take an isolationist stance, and he was a witness of this. He went to work in the United States, and more than 30 years later, about 30 years later, a bit less than 30 years later, he was back at this idea of cooperation. He was one of the architects, with many others, but he was one of the architects of the Treaty of Coal and Steels for Economic Cooperation between Germany and France. He laid the foundation, with many others, of the European Community, which what became later the European Community and the European Union. This man was Jean Monnet. He's among the people who are famous for having set the foundations of what is today the European Union. He had to fight his whole life for this, right? He never gave up. And this is the idea of this long game. Cooperation is the long game. And there are many, many stories of this type of struggles. Those who went to, African Americans who went to, in the trenches in World War I, went back home and did not enjoy any new civil rights. And they had to wait 40 years and more, and sometimes losing their lives in the struggle to enjoy the same civil rights as other American citizens. Women who, and all of those who work towards giving women the freedom of the right to vote also had to work for decades. This is a long game. And there are many, many examples of failures. And those who created the United Nations and one of its arms, the WHO, which we hear so much talking about these days, had seen the failure of the League of Nations. They hadn't given up, and they'd seized the political moment and built on it to build these institutions of cooperation. These people are an example that, despite the most tragic failure, some people haven't given up and dedicated a very, very long time. This is a long game. Cooperation is a long game, and they are the most tragic failures on the way sometimes. So if cooperation is so difficult and so important, one of the things that makes it particularly difficult is ideological divide. And this is my second part. How do we deal with ideological divide? Of course, very complex questions. And I will just attack it from a very specific angle. Right? The idea of respect. Right? So I will start with an example. Right? An example of beliefs. An example in Scientology, the believers of Scientology there's a ritual in which they have to give orders to an object, to an ashtray, and they ask the ashtray to stand up, and they ask the ashtray to stand down. Timothy Gordon Arsh, who used this example, gave another example, which I find very illustrative, of the cult of the high fivers. These are the people, and it's an imaginary cult, who believe that 2 + 2 = 5, and there's no way that 2 + 2 = 4. Most people among us would recognize such a belief to be absurd and not be able to respect it, right? So we cannot give to every belief respect, and philosopher Stephen Darwell called this appraisal respect. But what Darwell explains to us is that there is another type of respect that we owe to people that he calls recognition respect. So we have appraisal respect, the respect for the belief of the person, the recognition respect. And recognition respect is the respect that we give to others because they're human beings endowed with dignity, right? And this is recognition respect. And such a respect should not be taken away from any human being. Well, we may abhor certain beliefs of a person, we may believe that these beliefs are absurd, but there's often more to a person than his or her belief, and human beings are endowed with dignity that is worth this recognition respect, which doesn't mean appraisal respect of their beliefs. So Here, I want to say this may sound like an abstract point, a subtle distinction. And the first thing I will explain briefly in a short example. I find it quite difficult to practice, but I also believe it to be quite consequential and quite important. So let me take an example, a concrete example. I saw recently a post on a wall of someone I know in the social media, someone saying that he or she believes that these politicians in that country is worse than the coronavirus. And actually, I felt at myself very uneasy because this was part of a litany of similar comments, and it was part of a sequence of very angry, very sour comments, where all sort of issues were projected on the current comments. And I saw people liking the comments, and I felt upset. So I was maybe at some level tempted to respond, but I didn't. And reflecting on this, I could see two things. First, I realized that if this comment had been made about a politician or a party or an ideology that I believed to be deeply dangerous, I would not have felt upset or offended. I would not have agreed. I would not have respected that comment, but I might not have been upset. So my emotions were playing a role. My beliefs were playing a role here. And actually, because this person had made a series of comments, I felt actually quite hard because I felt started really angry at that person as a person, and and um, I felt it difficult to dissociate the belief of that person from the respect I owe to that person. However, if I systematically mix up and ignore differentiate the two, right, this is going to reduce um, I'm going to likely more likely to have feelings of hatred toward the person, and it's going to reduce the possibility of a dialogue, right? If I systematically mix up the two, appraisal respect and recognition respect, this actually stops and destroys, if I do it on a systematic basis, the conditions of the possibility of dialogues, right? So I think this distinction between appraisal respect, respect that I owe for the belief of someone, and recognition of that person as a human being handled with dignity is a difficult distinction, but it's also an important one that should be practiced, even though, as you said, I believe it's not so easy in practice. But I believe it to be equally important. So in short, to summarize, one, I've said that cooperation is obvious. It's a very long run game. It's a long run project. And today it's very acutely felt, but we have a lot of examples that show it's a long game and it's very difficult, but also examples of people who work for decades towards it. So it means that we can criticize the WHO, and we should and can, but we should not just dismiss the idea that cooperation is a necessity just on the basis we have some criticism of international institutions. It doesn't make the institution relevant. And second, cooperation requires dealing with ideological divide, and but it doesn't mean that we don't owe to others this recognition, respect as human beings endowed with dignity. And that is something that I believe is part of the instruments that we should use when to foster collaborations that is so deeply needed today and I believe tomorrow.
All right. Well, thank you, Francois, for your exposition. Great. So I agree with you basically, but I think if the argument is respect for the ideology of the other, so we can reach across our ideological divide and collaborate, I think we face a number of challenges today. They are not new. They are not new challenges. They've been around with us for many, many years, for a long time, but they are somewhat exacerbated these days. So I want to bring up three issues very, very briefly. And the first one, I think you did mention it, or you were going to mention it, which is the notion that, sure, you respect an ideology, but of course, there are some ideologies that unfortunately cannot be respected. So what am I going to say with that? So yes, I have no problem respecting someone that talks to an ashtray if it's Scientologist, or a Mormon that has a special type of underwear that is magical, or whatever belief people have, that's fine. The problem today in today's societies, and I would say not only in Western Europe and North America where we are, but also all over the world, you look at Brazil and India, but a lot of these ideologies that have been resurgence as of late, it's, as you are aware of, a lot of resurgence of white supremacy, neo-fascism, neo-Nazism, etc. Right? So I will respect an ideology as long as I don't have a gun pointed to my head. That is, it's very difficult to collaborate across an ideology that is actually threatening your life physically, right? So that's a little bit of a problem. And not to quote Winston Churchill, because he's a bit of a problematic figure himself, but collaborating with Nazis is not really perhaps so easy or even advisable to do, right? The second problem, again, is not new, but it's a challenge we face, and in particular today, is that oftentimes it's not so much a matter of ideology per se, it's really about political power. So we have ideology as a tool for exercising power, and not to belabor the obvious with Donald Trump, in the age of Donald Trump, I'm talking to you from the United States, so what can I say? But not to belabor the obvious about that. But the truth of the matter is that political operatives are using ideology to exercise their political agenda in a way that is really not connected to the ideology itself. So I can have respect for a certain ideology, but it has become basically a matter for identity politics. So basically, it's the in-group, out-group. You are in my team, I'm a Liverpool fan, you're a Manchester United fan, you are this team, I'm actually Thomas Frank in a book from 2004 called What's the Matter with Kansas. So this is nothing new. In fact, this is nothing new at all. This goes back all the way to the Southern strategy of Nixon and then going through the moral majority of Jerry Falwell, in which the Republican Party embraced the Christian right. But anyway, Thomas Frank illustrates very well how people with very little means keep voting against their economic interests because they are really driven and motivated by other cultural issues such as abortion, gun rights, etc. So this ideology is basically used to further the agenda of the people in power, which, by the way, also we have a dissolution of the norms and the institutions today with these bad faith actors that use ideology to do that, right? Actually, it's a very good piece by Jen Meyer in the New Yorker, came out last month, about Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, which, not to get into that, again, not to belabor the obvious, but what I found fascinating about that piece is that Mitch McConnell, according to everybody who knows him, and it's a very well-researched piece, doesn't really have an ideology. His ideology is basically his political power. So from that perspective, it's very difficult to deal with bad faith actors that use, it's not the content of ideology itself. I can respect your ideology. The truth of the matter is that ideology is just a tool for exercising power that is used by bad faith actors. And again, it's nothing new, but in today's environment is pretty rampant, which ties with the third point, and I finish here, which is perhaps it's not new either, but it's a bit more dangerous, which is how these people are able to do that. And it's the problem we have with the technologies today and these information bubbles they create, right? The Twitter bots and the Facebook pages, et cetera, et cetera. And so it is fascinating because there was a Economist YouGov poll in 2017, that's 2017, that's after the Obama years, in which 41% of self-identified Republicans believe that Barack Obama is born in Kenya. Now, and by the way, a very high percentage, I don't remember, believed he's a Muslim. Now, there is one thing, we look at a set of facts, and both of us look at the set of facts, and I filter those facts through my ideological lens, and you filter them through your ideological lens, and we reach different conclusions based on the same set of facts. But it's a whole different matter when those set of facts are different. It's just a matter of facts, whether it's Barack Obama either born in Kenya or he isn't, right? It's just very easy to understand. So we have a huge problem these days in which people live in these informational bubbles that are related to their identity, in which it's no longer a matter of ideology per se, or how we filter the facts, but it's a problem we have with the facts themselves. And so that's really a very problematic issue we're facing. So those are challenges. Those are three challenges that I think complicate a little bit the vision of this long march towards this collaborative activities across ideological barriers. Again, not in a way that Jean Monnet would not have experienced after World War I, but I think in today's environment, they're a little bit more difficult. So if you may want to address those issues, how would you think about that?
Yeah, so thank you, Jaume. So the first point was about certain type of ideologies, right? And it's common in a number of countries that when an ideology puts into harm's way people, creates hatred, and actually is a threat, a physical threat even to people, then at some level society cannot tolerate it, and there should be sanctions and prohibitions. So that's the first thing, is to recognize that one, there's something that goes beyond respecting or not respecting, giving this appraisal respect or not appraisal respect, but beyond not giving appraisal, there's even, and it is recognized in a number of law systems, that some beliefs put people in harm's way, and when they are propagated, and that is not tolerable, and that's the same in any community and in any society. The second point was these bad faith actors. Basically, it's about power, right? And I think it's a nice counterpoint you're making here, because when you hear just my exposition, it sounds like, well, if we practice this, this is important. But the reality is that power balances are at work. They are there. They're not going to go away. And there's no, I think very few people would be tempted to think, oh no, that's not happening. We see it every day. And people use beliefs to gain power, right? And we have that example of that almost on a daily basis if we play close eye in many countries, right? So that doesn't in itself ruins the idea of this tool of differentiating among those who are interested in having a dialogue, keeping in mind that when they address others, whether it's in a forum, a public forum, or in a private conversation, that this recognition respect is not to be mixed up with this appraisal respect. And that is a tool that may not be sufficient to overcome the play of power, but is one of the tools that can be there, and that's being aware of this is important, right? And I think your third point was about what was your third point, Jama? Just remind me.
The third point was about the information bubbles. They're really hard to overcome, ideological divides, when the people have different sets of facts by which to filter the ideology.
So here at this point about appraisal versus recognition respect, this is a tool, but it doesn't address that problem, right? That is a separate problem. These bubbles that are created and manufactured actually are there, and makes it difficult because the divide, and that's part of the title of the session, we are in this divided world, and part of this divide is carefully manufactured by those who have an interest and reinforced by those who have an interest, whatever that interest may be, in reinforcing this divide, making dialogue even more difficult. And you have this in-group, out-group effect, where you assume certain things about the other groups. But precisely when you are face-to-face with someone who belongs to that other group, that's where this division between the belief of that person, which I do not owe praise or respect for, they should not erase this recognition, respect that I owe to that person. And that's, at least at an individual, personal level, even though it's made hard, I'm not denying that, but it creates at least a foundation upon which you can actually create a wedge so that you can have more dialogue. And I believe that that goes across the ideological divide. So it's not solving it, but it's giving you a tool to address dialogue with people who are so different beliefs. Okay. Okay.
Right.
So I see on the on the chat how one question about how we practice how we practice the recognition respect, and let me check. Yeah, I see something about availability bias. I'm not, if the person who made that comment can reformulate the question, I'd be delighted to at least address it. So I think in terms of practicing it beyond the strictly individual level, which I emphasize is not necessarily easy when our emotions are there and our bias are there. I think it's useful to have in public debates at the outset a reminder about the rules of the game and how given that it is an issue, right? Given that it is an issue, we should actually remind the rules of the game so that it becomes a sort of public knowledge, a sort of an institutional agreement by whoever is chairing that meeting, and reminded that we should take a step and avoid judging the people, and that we may have deep belief disagreement, but we should remember we're a shared community, and that that I think that's something that can and may happen in moderation of debates, and that means also for whoever is engaged in these public debates and organizing them and sharing them, that any form of actually type of language which is dehumanizing, so using animalistic metaphors, even in a supposedly joking way, right? Comparing people to rats or to this also should be actually quite severely monitored, because this is precisely where you've got the signal that there is an absence of recognition of the people as endowed with dignity, and that you're engaged in a proper dialogue. And I think that that's in this forum, this is something by the organizer that should be very carefully considered and monitored and discussed and reflected upon as how to set the conditions of this dialogue, whether it's a debate at a university, a public debate in a forum, or whether it's a debate about a book or whatever that may be. Okay.
Okay. All right. So Francois, I was thinking while you were talking about this. So another challenge we face regarding what you were saying, I think that makes a lot of sense. The problem we have is try to upkeep or police the type of respect that you're advocating. We're running into a weaponization of freedom of speech laws here in the U.S. in particular. The First Amendment makes it very, very difficult to really monitor that type of speech, both hate speech, and theoretically you're not supposed to do hate speech. And by the way, it's not only a US problem only, it's everywhere. In Twitter, you're probably familiar with the issues we're having now today. I think for the first time yesterday, Twitter put some sort of correction on one of Trump's tweets. Right. So the problem is not using this metaphors about the rats, etc. Yeah, who's going to monitor that? The problem we have today is this First Amendment laws or freedom of speech laws are being sort of weaponized for this. I was saying before, political operatives are using ideology as a means of mobilizing identity politics, right? As you know, we're coming to a point where if you're wearing a mask, you're a liberal. If you're not wearing a mask, you're a Republican. And so when you get into that kind of identity politics, in what sense can you begin to talk about the ideology that underlies it? So there is a question here. Oh, I saw a question. It's Catherine.
Well,
oh, it's a comment. Yeah,
it's a comment about reinforcement.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, so I think this is by all means a serious issue. And actually under this freedom of speech, and it has been discussed. This is not actually Timothy Garton-Ash made a whole series about this. There is actually an issue that because of this confusion, you're not even allowed to have appraisal disrespect, which actually curfew and block freedom of speech on campuses. So this is a sensitive issue there to be dealt with. But I think this notion, which is actually is a venerable distinction that's been around for almost 50 years, half a century now, is very useful to think about these issues. Okay, so I think we're reaching the end of our session, of our webinar. So first, I want to thank you, Jama, for being there with us on a Wednesday morning in New York.
Thank you for inviting me, Francois. Always a pleasure talking to you.
Right, and so thank you also for all those who tuned in on the different channels. And remember that for all those who are interested, they can have a look at this talk on our different channels. And I would like to wish wherever you are a good afternoon, a good morning, or a good night. And hope you're safe at home or wherever you are. Thank you, everyone.